Hello and welcome to the Cogit podcast series. My name's Anthony Richards and I'm the editorial director of Cogit. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Raffaello Pantucci. He is a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He is widely recognized for his research around terrorism and counterterrorism, and is the author of the book, We Love Death as You Love Life, Britain's Suburban Terrorists, which was published in 2015 and was acclaimed by the Financial Times as the most articulate and carefully researched account of Britain's suburban terrorists to date. Raffaello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Anthony, for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
The first question, in the chapter that you kindly contributed to our volume, you covered you identified and covered 4 time periods up to around 2017, 2018, in terms of the nature of the threat that the UK faced in relation to terrorism. Nearly 4 years on, I guess, since then, how would you characterize the nature and severity of the contemporary terror threat confronting the UK now?
I mean, I think the threat remains pretty persistent. And I think that's kind of the key point in some ways to draw out. In the 4 sort of time periods I defined, I think the most contemporary one in some ways is essentially extended onto where we are today. And in some ways become far more confused, to the point where I think when we were talking about the last phase, which I think ended in 2017, we were talking about a period where we kind of had an apex in some ways of terrorist threats to the United Kingdom. I mean, it'd been years since we'd had lots of big attacks, and suddenly we had, 4 successful Islamist attacks in 1 year, and then a right-wing one as well. One of which included, the Manchester Arena bombing, which was a very successful and grim terrorist attack on the British mainland. So we hadn't had this in a while, and suddenly we have a whole spate of it. And that was kind of an apex in some way of a threat that you'd seen coming out of Syria and Iraq and the broader ISIS picture, where you had these kind of isolated individuals mixed up with these individuals who had links to networks, and this sort of hint that actually there was even potentially some direction there. And then lots of kind of long-term threats that seem to be going on and on and on. So we had this kind of whole series of issues that seemed to come into a climax in 2017. And then what we see after that is the problem kind of persists, but it persists at a lower level. I think 2017 was a bit of a peak. After that, we see a sort of number of attacks taking place. But what we see happening is a lot of these attacks tend to be lone actors, or very small cells of individuals. The links to organized groups get more and more distant, and the kinds of attacks become more and more random. And to the stage where I think we're at now, which is where we see the 2 attacks that we've had, so far this year, the 2 sadly successful attacks, the murder of Sir David Amess and the incident in Liverpool, which I think really show kind of how diffuse in some way the terrorist threat picture now is, where you've got these individuals, and from what we understand of the Sir David Amess culprit, he was someone who was inspired at least in part by ISIS, but so far no evidence has been produced that he was connected to it. The group itself didn't even bother to claim the attack. And then we have the incident in Liverpool, where we really don't know what actually seems to have taken place, but there seems to be all sorts of ideas percolating around about what he might have actually intended his goal to be. And that confusion has produced the effect of JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center, which is the one that sets the terrorist threat risk levels in the United Kingdom, to raise the British threat level to severe, which means that they expect an attack potentially to happen at any moment. And I think that's not necessarily a reflection of a kind of directed threat that they see anymore, but more a reflection of the fact that the threat has become so diffuse, it's become essentially almost impossible for the planners to be able to predict exactly where it's going to come from anymore.
That's fascinating. Thanks very much, Raphael. You mentioned the word diffuse there, and we are in many ways confronted by a decentralized terrorist threat, I guess. So how do you see the nature of the tactics evolving in that context, i.e., from relatively rudimentary attacks that might use knives and vehicles to the relatively more sophisticated attack, like the Manchester bombing you noted there, but also slightly botched ones in between, maybe? I mean, how do you see the tactical evolution work in terms of terrorism?
I mean, the thing that's really surprising unsurprising about terrorists is how they really tend to always fall back on the same things. So when you go back and you can go back and look at earlier plots as well, you see these incredibly sophisticated ideas being dreamt up. If you think right back to 2004, the first kind of big Islamist network plot that was disrupting the United Kingdom, Operation Crevice, they had this ambitious, they had, tons of plans. They were discussing poisoning people outside football matches. They were going to put something in the water supply. They were going to do, all these very, very complicated things. And then in the end, what do they fall back on? Let's just build a big fertilizer bomb and leave outside a shopping mall. A very traditional kind of model to fall back on. But the truth is that continues to be the kind of pattern that you see. And so you'll see now people, what's interesting, I suppose, is you are seeing more of the lone actors continuing to try to make bombs. They do still want to try to make bombs. They do still see bombs as a thing that they want to actually make and will make their act more significant. So we continue to see that desire by individuals. But making a bomb is quite difficult, and making a bomb that goes off when you want it to is very difficult. It takes practice, it takes training, it takes experience, and they don't get a chance to do that because they're just doing it at home. But I think what in some ways is worrying is something that maybe we haven't seen articulated that much in the UK yet, but we have definitely seen on the continent. And we have seen it in some of the right-wing networks in the UK, but it's a desire to move to new technologies. So we've seen 3D printers showing up, people trying to build weapons with 3D printers. We've seen on the continent, in France, a right-wing individual who is actually trying to source uranium from eBay, which he was going to put into a bomb. They had actually made a sort of successfully viable device. And we've seen numbers of people trying to make various types of poisons. And the accessibility of this technology and the accessibility of these kinds of weapons is getting lower and lower and lower. And it's not necessarily that the technical capability of these people is increasing, it's becoming much easier to access these kinds of weapons. And so there's a potentially quite worrying trend there that we can see on the horizon, which I think is something to worry about within the lone actor space, because then, if you're just dealing with a lone actor who's going to take a few knives, maybe if he's very lucky, he gets hands on a gun, maybe make a successful bomb, you're still dealing with a relatively limited threat. If you're talking about lone actors who can make these kinds of sophisticated weapons that are really weapons of mass destruction, you're talking about a threat which could really jump out at us in a truly shocking way.
That's a really, really interesting point, because I suppose at one time you might have made the correlation between less sophisticated attacks and the decentralized nature of the threat. And perhaps the more sophistication might be more correlated with more group-based terrorism. And, that's slightly speculative. But what you're suggesting here is that actually, even with these decentralized lone actor terrorists, the level of sophistication could be enhanced to a degree to actually carry out quite sophisticated attacks.
Yeah, I think the one to think back to is Anders Behring Breivik, the 2011 attacker in Norway, who murdered 77 people in, what was a pretty big attack, detonating a large device and then going on the shooting rampage. But this was very much his concoction. It was entirely him doing it by himself. And he launched this sort of mass spectacular. And he did it using the sort of classic methods. I think the problem now is that the individual who's planning to do that sort of thing can do something even more spectacular now with the potential weapons that are increasingly sort of available around us. And it's really a story of how do authorities manage to stay on top of some of these tools and the sophistication. And in some ways, if we really think sort of trace way forwards, I think the real horror scenario would be that you end up with a sort of group of these lone actors who connect online and in disparate parts of the globe decide to do some sort of spectacular at the same time. The impact of something like that would be huge. But I think it would take us a while to process exactly what had happened, when in reality, what it was kind of a supercharged version of the lone actor network.
Yeah, but thank you for that. Looking forward, I suppose a slightly different question really. Should we be more concerned about the ISIS-inspired threat from terrorism, or should we be more concerned about Al-Qaeda?
This is an interesting question in a way, because the dilemma is, yes, they are two different groups, but is the threat, different in some sort of way? In many ways, they want the same kind of goals. The kind of method of delivery is slightly different, but it's always worth remembering that, of course, the ISIS ideas of, this kind of diffuse threat, these individuals just launching lone actor attacks wherever they can, killing whoever they can find, is something that was in some ways drawn from Al-Qaeda thinking. you know, you can go back and look at sort of Abu Musab al-Suri's writing, who was writing very much about this kind of global resistance, you know, this global insurgency. That's the kind of vision he had, that he put forwards. That then you saw Inspire magazine, created by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Ammar al-Awlaki, you know, pushing forwards in 2010. And, you know, this whole idea of just do it terrorism, this idea of people just making bombs at home and detonating it themselves whenever they could, not waiting for, you know, some group to tell them or to go to a training camp, but just kind of get on with it and do the attack. This was something that Al-Qaeda was pushing for a long time, but they didn't quite manage to click in some ways. And the technology maybe around communications hadn't matured to the point that we then saw it mature when ISIS sort of had its heyday and was able to really utilize this connectivity and this link to its people on the ground to instigate and inspire them to do it. And I think the key takeaway I'd say from that is that that says to me that Al-Qaeda probably would, if it could, pull the same trick off, but it's just sort of not been able to. But if the groups are able to both kind of mature again and really reestablish their networks and reestablish bases and start to have kind of credible narrative they can project out that is appealing to people, I wouldn't necessarily say that we should discount the idea of an Al-Qaeda inspired threat suddenly emerging once again. The final thing I'd say on this is it's notable to me that of the last attacks we've seen in Europe in particular, ISIS hasn't really bothered to comment. You know, the incident that we saw with the murder of Sir David Amos, the incident in Liverpool, and even there was an incident, a strange incident in Norway in between, you might remember, where an individual went on some sort of stabbing rampage and was apparently brandishing a bow and arrow. You know, these were all attacks that in the past, you would have seen ISIS jump up and down and say, oh, that's our people, you know, but they didn't this time. And I think there's something interesting happening there in terms of the group not paying attention as much or not being that interested in the same way as it was before on this side of the threat picture.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. Something else you noted in your chapter that you kindly contributed to us was this emerging trend of perpetrators who'd moved away from common criminality into terrorism. I'm just wondering whether perhaps in the last 3 or 4 years that's a sort of continuing trend. And if it is, I mean, what are the implications for response, you know, if somebody's got a criminal background?
I mean, the numbers are difficult. I'm trying to think. I think if we look at the kind of attacks that we've seen recently, there have been some that have demonstrated some element of prior criminal activity. And I think it's a problem that has kind of always been somewhere in the background, but never kind of taken off in the way that we expected. So there was always a level of concern around, you know, organized criminality, for example, and the kind of crossovers you sometimes saw between organized criminal networks and, you know, the communities that organized criminal networks came from and the communities that terrorists came from. And of course, people always look at a place like Molenbeek in Belgium as the kind of archetypal example. And in the UK context, people tended not to focus on this that much. But I think it was always interesting because if you look at some of the criminal fraternities in East Birmingham, for example, they do cross over into this territory. And then even more worryingly, and I suppose depressingly, was the attack we saw in Manchester, where we saw Salman Abedi came from a kind of Libyan milieu, Libyan, you know, criminal fraternity, if you will, not all Libyan criminal fraternity, but, you know, a fraternity of young criminals, not necessarily organized crime in the sort of, you know, mafia sense of the word, but, you know, definitely gangs that had a bit more wherewithal about them than just, you know, a bunch of petty criminals. And it did create something there, which, you know, we see coming out in the inquest quite a lot. And it's not clear where the lines of the kind of threat of the two sit, but it's clear that there's something that was kind of happening there, which is interesting. And I think the fact that we're already seeing that coming out now does make me think about whether we need to rethink some of our assumptions around the crossover between criminality and terrorism. Because I think in some ways we maybe not necessarily focused on this element of it. And I think important parts of it is around the prisons, whereas we see in prisons radicalization does take place. I think we don't know enough about what people radicalize in prisons and then come out and try to launch attacks or become involved in networks. I think we have sort of assumptions that it kind of happens amongst a certain group, but we don't, I think, know enough about them. And I think then on the response side, it's really about, you know, trying to understand, you know, how this probably changes the individuals you're looking at. I think if you look at some of the people who went off to fight with ISIS in particular, they were a pretty bloodthirsty bunch in some cases, you know, and I think in some cases you can make a pretty compelling case that they were essentially, you know, criminals with a psychopathic tendency who had a proclivity towards violence, for whom ISIS was offering a pretty appealing narrative of cleaning yourself while doing all the stuff you like to do, which is, pretty atrocious sort of criminal activity. And that tweak, I think, was something that ISIS got kind of right. And I think the consequences of that as they play out going forwards are worth thinking about, because it does, I think, probably need to make you think about how you're going to manage these sorts of individuals who are maybe espousing a terrorist ideology or connecting with the terrorist ideology, but in fact are probably driven by some far more basic, criminal tendencies.
No, that's really interesting. And it kind of tells us from what you're saying there that it's not all just about ideological conviction when we're looking at the motivations, perhaps for joining outfits like ISIS.
Absolutely.
A final question, Raffaello, if I may. I know you contributed recently a paper to the European Institute for Counterterrorism and Conflict Prevention that contemplated in these very early days still any potential impact of the pandemic on the contemporary terrorist threat. And I just wondered if you'd be kind enough to share some of your early thoughts on that, although it is, of course, very early days still.
Sure. Well, I mean, thanks for the question. Thanks for flagging the paper. I mean, it's a one that it came out of a stream of work I've been doing during the pandemic, where various questions have been asked about what does the pandemic mean for terrorist threats, and how they sort of change as a result. And my conclusion is, as you correctly point out, it's a bit too early to tell. We're still in the midst of the pandemic in some ways, and so it's difficult to be able to make a conclusive determinations about what's materially changed. But I think if we look at some of the early elements, I think there are some things that are notable. I think one of the interesting observations is the degree to which the violent Islamist networks don't seem that interested in the pandemic. So if we look at Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they both made statements about it. ISIS in particular, Al-Qaeda is always a bit more judicious in its commentary, but, ISIS was quite liberal and actually came to the discussion quite late and eventually did start talking about it. And it talked about it as though this was God punishing their adversaries, and conveniently in some ways, the pandemic spread, from China to Iran and then the West, their three adversaries, one after another. So that fed that narrative quite tightly. And, their advice, though, when you look at it, it was fairly in line in many ways with what the WHO was saying, stay away from people, wash yourself, it wasn't that earth-shattering. And I think in many ways, the group basically said, look, this is God's will. We must submit to God's will. And that's the end of that. And we will proceed on as normal. They did say we will try to take advantage of our adversaries now that they're down. But it's been very, 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 very difficult to see any tangible evidence of groups then actioning that kind of broad statement. You have seen an interesting level of chatter where in a number of contexts, you've seen individuals, cells being disrupted where the guys are talking about, oh, well, we should get one of our guys sick and then send him coughing into a synagogue or something, and there was one plot in Indonesia, I think it was, where they were overheard saying, we'll infect some children and then that'll really make it go crazy. But I mean, there's no evidence that this was actually materialized. And I maybe go back to my earlier answer about, how these guys love to talk a lot about what they're going to do, but not actually necessarily, and they tend to fall back on the same, 2 or 3 basic typologies of plotting. But I think the key thing is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they talked a bit about it, but they didn't really do much. And actually, it's a real question about what impact it's had on their kind of outlook and what they're trying to do. It has had a practical impact, I would say. And in some contexts, you've seen how groups have struggled. In particular, I think in parts of Southeast Asia, you can see that, there is some pretty compelling evidence that groups have really struggled, frankly, to work around the restrictions that have come down as a result. They found it quite challenging to move around, to operate, to run the same criminal networks that they were using before to raise money. And so that sort of complicated their ability to act. In other cases, they've talked about, trying to use the pandemic to get their people to give more money because they're saying, well, God has clearly sent the apocalypse is now upon us, so now quickly give us all your money so we can spend it to do the jihad, So you can see that narrative kind of playing out, but it does seem to have had an effect to some degree in Southeast Asia, at least in terms of reducing the threat. But, it's also worth observing that the threat picture has been going down for a little while here anyway. And so we go back to the point of we have to wait and see in some ways when the pandemic's over, if it just picks up again, or if it kind of stays at this lowered plateau. If we look instead at other ideologies, the extreme right wing, I think, is probably the most interesting one in some ways. And in part, that's because the extreme right wing is so diffuse and so broad these days that it's almost impossible to entirely pin down. But then also because I think the right wing we've seen emerge recently is very online heavy. You've got networks that are emerging online that never have a kind of physical presence in the real world. The online group is the group essentially, and it's just a group of guys on a Telegram channel, and that's the terrorist organization, right? And they don't necessarily even meet up for training camps, this. And so within that context, for them, the conspiracy theories, the narratives, the imagery have been a boon in many ways. And you've seen them really leap onto them and use them to really fan the flames of their narratives and give a sense of being in the now and doing something, in this whole sense of acceleration and, a hurry and the world coming to an end and a struggle that needs to be fought. That is something that they've really capitalized on. And in some contexts, you can see have really done, quite well out of. In some really depressing cases in some parts of Central Eastern Europe that I won't particularly mention name by name, but you can see that frankly ruling parties have started to co-opt some of these conspiracy theories, which you see being openly peddled by these extreme right groups, and really pulling those groups into the mainstream because they're essentially advocating the same thing. And so what I'm saying there is the danger is that you're really mainstreaming an extreme right-wing narrative. And there are consequences to that, which I think sadly we saw play out in the United States. And I think we're going to sadly see playing out more in parts of Central Eastern Europe going forwards. And then if we move on from the right wing to talk about some of the conspiracy theory stuff that we see popping up, it's interesting because that sits somewhere in between the right. It's not entirely right-wing all the time. We've got other groups like incels that have become quite prominent over the past few years. Again, very online-based and voluntary celibates, but they're not entirely right-wing. They're also a bit left-wing. They're a bit everything. They're not really ideologically driven. They're driven by a different sort of set of motivations, which seems to be fundamentally about, men not being able to get laid. But this is driving a sort of terrorist anger. And again, during the pandemic, these kinds of very online ideologies have been strengthened, not only in terms of the kind of ability to control the narratives and the narratives multiplying in wonderful ways for them to be able to advance themselves further, but also in terms of their captive audience. People are online a lot more, and people are not interacting with each other. They're basically their entire lives are being lived down a computer screen. And so this sends some people into quite dark corners, and people who maybe have a proclivity towards isolation, who would struggle actually to socially interact with people in other contexts. In this context, they can interact with people online. It's a very different environment. It's much easier for them to get really quite deeply into these groups. And then there's a danger when they finally do come out or the group gets shut down, that they find themselves bereft and might go and do something terrible or angry as a result. So this is something that I think has been supercharged in some ways by the pandemic. The only final point I'd add on this, and I apologize, I've gone on a bit about this question, but it's one I've given some thought to, is I think a sense of anti-establishmentarianism, and I think my sense has always been that terrorist groups are fundamentally, by definition, terrorist groups are an anti-state organization, right? It's something that's against the state. It's overturning an established order to build a new perfect one that they've got, lined up in their book or something. This kind of anger towards the state has also become increasingly mainstream, and you can see this in some of the discourse around, pandemic related restrictions, and the kind of anger that people feel towards that, and that rage that the state is imposing this upon them. It's really creating something quite curious, and something that we are seeing starting to express itself in violence, against, for the most part at the moment, infrastructure. So 5G mast burnings, for example, or some of the anti-vax, attacks that we've seen take place. This sort of anger towards science, this anger towards the establishment has really gone in all sorts of different directions that is interestingly tying together all sorts of different ideologies. So you see parts of the left and the right, and then these conspiracy theories, and then these other ideologies that are sort of rattling around, all sort of coming together in these bizarre fusions that are fundamentally basically against the state there. And I think that's an interesting to watch going forwards, because previously, these kinds of, quite idiosyncratic, crazy ideologies were quite individual, right? So you could look back at the Unabomber maybe as an early example of this. Ted Kaczynski, living in the mountains wherever he was, mailing bombs around America and writing these, this long treatise about, the end technology and humanity or something. And then that was an isolated guy, right? But here you're talking about a movement that actually seems to have quite a wide footprint in odd places in society they wouldn't necessarily expect. And I don't want to say that all of this kind of anti-vax or anti-vax is going to turn into a terrorist threat, but traditionally, we have seen that when you have these kinds of large disillusioned groups, it does produce some elements of violence within it. And I think how that plays out going forwards is going to be really interesting to watch, especially given the fact that the pandemic doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. And we still see governments talking about imposing restrictions. And we can see the anger that people express towards these restrictions in their imposition is getting sharper and sharper and sharper. So I think that's probably a space to watch out for within this kind of, how COVID has impacted terrorism space, which I think we still have to kind of see the other shoe drop on.
Thank you very much for those fascinating insights, Raffaello. That's really interesting. So, Raffaello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your expertise with us. It's very much appreciated. Thanks again. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Combating Jihadist Terror. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more episodes, they're available to watch on our website, cogit.org, or to listen to on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thanks again.